8th grade review. What have you learned this year? Boy, have we covered a lot, but I'm sure you're going to be able to remember it or most of it. So, let's review. The New World. When the first Europeans arrived in the Western Hemisphere, they encountered Native Americans. There were three main Native American empires, all centered in Mexico or South America: the Aztec and Maya, which were in Mexico, and the Inca, which were in Peru. Although these civilizations were very advanced, their lack of technology, horses, and immunity to European diseases caused them to be easily conquered. Who were the conquerors, also known as the conquistadors? In Spain, they mostly came for riches, gold and silver, but they also wanted to convert natives to Christianity. The Spanish had no intention of doing any work. That was for the Native Americans to do. The Portuguese, for Portugal, thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas, was restricted only to Brazil and Africa. The Treaty of Tordesillas was where the Pope drew a line based upon longitude, and all territory west of the line went to Spain, and all the territory east of the line went to Portugal. One of the most important consequences of the Eastern Hemisphere meeting the Western Hemisphere, or the Old World meeting the New World, was something called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was an exchange of people, technology, food, plants, animals, diseases, and culture between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres. It changed how people lived on both sides of the Atlantic permanently. This was an example of cultural diffusion. Long-term causes of the Columbian Exchange were God, gold, and glory. That's the reason why the conquistadors came. The long-term effects were the spread of products all around the world, population growth in Europe, Asia, and Africa, cultural diffusion, migration from Europe to the Americas, and the growth of capitalism. Immediate causes were that Europeans arrive in the Americas and they bring with them new plants, animals, and diseases. Because of these things, the Spanish conquer the Aztecs and Indians, Native Americans die of European diseases, enslaved Africans are brought to the Americas, and American foods are introduced to other parts of the world. Who came to North America? Primarily four countries: France, England, the Netherlands, and Spain. The French came but made few permanent settlements. They were interested in the fur trade. They settled in Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. The English came but made permanent settlements on the East Coast. They settled for a variety of reasons, anything from religious freedom to getting rich quick. The Netherlands came for trade. The Netherlands are also known as the country of Holland and the Dutch. Spain came for God, glory, and gold. They settled along the West Coast, the Southwest, and in Florida. The Native Americans, the Europeans found already living in North America, were broken into 8 different cultural groups. The geography of each region influenced how each group lived. For example, the Plains Indians. They lived in the grasslands of the Midwest. Their way of life was based on the buffalo who ate the grass. For food, the Plains Indians ate dried buffalo meat. For shelter, they had teepees made from buffalo hide. For clothing, made from buffalo skin. Fuel, dried buffalo pies. Tools, buffalo bones and sinews. These Indians never permanently settled in one place, unlike some other Indian groups, because they followed the buffalo. The 13 colonies. What is a colony? A colony is a group of people and their descendants who settle in a distant territory but remained subject to or closely attached to a parent country. Economic, political, and religious tensions in England led many thousands of people to emigrate to the English colonies in North America between 1629 and 1640. This period of time is called the Great Migration. Jamestown. Jamestown was the first successful English colony in the New World. It was located in Virginia, and settlement began in 1607. The first settlers in Jamestown came to get rich, but unable to find gold, they settled on growing cash crops like tobacco. Captain John Smith led the colony. He was helped by Pocahontas. The people who came to Jamestown came because they were promised the same rights as if they were living in England. Later, indentured servants also came to Jamestown. An indentured servant is somebody who has the cost of their voyage paid for, and then when arriving in the New World, worked for a certain number of years to pay off the cost of that voyage. Plymouth. Plymouth was settled by the Pilgrims. It was located on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and it began in 1620. The Pilgrims came for religious freedom. They also wrote the Mayflower Compact, the first government document written in the New World. The Mayflower Compact established fair laws designed to protect the general good. The Puritans. The Puritans settled near the Pilgrims around Boston. The name of the Puritan colony was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it began in 1630. The Puritans established the colony because they wanted to create an ideal Christian community. Their colony was immediately successful, mostly because it was well planned. Government, religion, and education were closely linked in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. What is the difference between the Puritans and the Pilgrims? The Pilgrims were a more extreme form of the Puritan religion. The colony of New York was established as a Dutch trading post named New Amsterdam, which was located on the island of Manhattan and was established in 1613. New York was the center of the region's fur trade, and it had a policy of religious toleration which allowed Jews, Swedes, Protestants, and other groups to settle. In 1644, the English captured the settlement of New Amsterdam and changed its name to New York. The colony of Pennsylvania was settled by English Quakers in 1681. The Quakers are a religious group. They believe in the equality of men and women before God. They also believe in a policy of nonviolence and religious toleration. The Quakers established the city of Philadelphia, which means brotherly love, as the capital of that colony. The colony of Maryland was settled by English Catholics in 1689. Maryland passed the Religious Toleration Act, which allowed Christians the freedom of religion. Non-Christians were treated very harshly. Differences in geography, religion, and where the settlers came from caused the 13 colonies to be split into three groups: New England, Middle, and Southern. The New England colonies, cold weather and rocky soil made cash crop farming impossible. New England farmers grew only those crops that they would use themselves. However, New England had good ports, good fishing, and lots of timber, which made New England base their economy on trade, fishing, and shipbuilding. The New England colonies were self-governing. Religion strongly influenced everything, and they were mostly settled by the English. Mild winters, hot summers, and good soil made the southern colonies base their economy on cash crops, things like tobacco, indigo, rice, and cotton. There was some self-government in the southern colonies. They used slave labor, and rivers were important for transportation. The southern colonies were settled by English Protestants and Scots-Irish. The middle colonies had a mix of climates, peoples, geography, which created a variety of economies, religions, and a way of life. There was some self-government in the middle colonies. Mercantilism was the economic system which existed between England and her North American colonies. Under mercantilism, England makes all the profit. What would happen is that the colonies would send their raw materials to England, things like lumber, cotton, and hides. England's factories and labor force would then take the raw materials and turn them into finished goods, such things as paint, kettles, and cloth. England would then ship the finished goods back to the colonies, who must buy the products, because the colonies have no factories of their own. Who makes all the profit? England. What was the French and Indian War? How did it lead to the American Revolution? The French and Indian War ran from 1754 to 1763. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. This was the First World War because it was fought on more than one continent. As a consequence of the French and Indian War, Great Britain got Canada from France. Great Britain had won the war. It also caused great debt, which created a need for new taxation. This caused Great Britain to begin paying attention to the colonies for the first time. Great Britain felt the need to control colonial self-government. What was the war's impact upon the colonies? It united the colonies against the common enemy for the first time, France and the Native Americans who sided with France. The colonies began interacting and socializing amongst themselves. It also created bitter feelings against the British, which would only intensify, and the colonies resented the new British interest in her colonial possessions. The American Revolution. What are patriots? American colonists who supported and fought for independence from Great Britain, also called England. What are loyalists? Colonists who sided with Great Britain during the American Revolution. Who are the Sons of Liberty? A secret society formed to protest British actions and push for American independence. The 10 events that led to the American Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763, in an attempt to keep the conflict down between Native Americans and English settlers, King George III drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and told the colonists that they can't settle west of the line, that west of the line the land belonged to the Indians. What were the consequences of the Proclamation of 1763? Well, tension. Settlers were already living west of the Appalachian Mountains. They thought the proclamation was tyranny, and they decided to ignore it. Great Britain, on the other hand, was furious the colonies were ignoring the King's proclamation. They think the colonies are getting out of control, and Great Britain sends 7,500 troops to the Americas. The Stamp Act of 1765. Great Britain places a tax on all paper products to help pay off war debts. Great Britain thinks the colonies need to pay their fair share of the cost of their own defense. What were the consequences of the Stamp Act? The colonies were outraged. This was taxation without representation. The colonies had no representation in the British Parliament. Tax collectors were attacked throughout the colonies, and the violence was so great that Parliament repealed the act. The Quartering Act of 1765. Parliament required the colonies to provide British troops with quarters, which means housing, as well as food and supplies. What were the consequences of the Quartering Act? Well, the colonies refused to obey it. They said the Quartering Act was just another tax. Great Britain then says that the colonial assemblies can't meet until the colonies obey the act. Tempers are really rising now on both sides of the Atlantic. And while we don't pay much attention to the Quartering Act today, the colonists felt so strongly about it that it inspired the Third Amendment to our Constitution. The Townshend Acts of 1767. The British Prime Minister Townshend believes colonial behavior requires a permanent standing army in America. To pay for it, he places a tax on all imported British goods, things like tea, paint, glass, and paper. What were the consequences of the Townshend Act? Well, there was a general boycott of all British goods throughout the colonies. The colonists were determined not to pay for taxes they had voted upon. Remember, there were no colonial representatives in the British Parliament. Furthermore, when settlement began in North America, Great Britain promised the settlers that they would receive the same rights as Englishmen back home. However, in England, colonial behavior and its boycott strengthened the British belief that the colonies are really getting out of control. The Boston Massacre of 1770. Britain sent 4 regiments to keep order in Boston. Boston was where a lot of the colonial troublemakers were located. A small riot broke out between the troops and the colonists, and 5 colonists died. What were the consequences of the Boston Massacre? Great Britain felt the Boston Patriots were really big troublemakers. The soldiers who fired upon the crowd stand trial but are acquitted. The Patriots believe the massacre is proof that Britain needs to remove her troops. The Loyalists feel the massacre is proof that troops are needed to control the Patriots, and the massacre is used as Patriot propaganda throughout the colonies. The Tea Act of 1773. The colonial boycott of tea was causing the British East India Company to go bankrupt. Parliament lowered the prices of tea and gave the East India Company a monopoly over colonial tea sales. What were the consequences of the Tea Act? Well, the colonists were alarmed by a monopoly. They fear other monopolies will follow. American tea merchants are angry that the British government is trying to put them out of business. The Boston Tea Party. American protests over the Tea Act kept the tea from being unloaded from ships in Boston Harbor. Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Mohawk Indians, dumped 90,000 pounds of the unloaded tea in Boston Harbor on the night of December 16, 1773. What were the consequences of the Boston Tea Party? Well, patriots throughout the colonies were excited and united by the fact that the Sons of Liberty had stood up to a tyrannical and unjust mother country. Britain, on the other hand, was determined to teach the colonists a lesson for what they did. The Intolerable Acts of 1774 were specifically designed as a punishment for the Boston Tea Party. They were extremely harsh laws that outraged everybody. Great Britain closed Boston Harbor until the tea is paid for. Remember, Boston is a trading city. That's where it makes its money. The Massachusetts government is taken away from the colonists and firmly placed under British control. English soldiers who've been stationed in the Americas, if they kill any colonists, they are now to stand trial in England, and more troops are now sent to the colonies. What are the consequences of the Boston Tea Party? All colonies are outraged by harsh British reaction to the Tea Party, and for the first time they begin to unite. Committees of correspondence, which just mean people in some colonies write to keep people in other colonies informed about what's going on, they are set up. The First Continental Congress of 1774. The Intolerable Acts resulted in 12 of 13 colonies sending representatives to Philadelphia to seek a solution to the conflict between the colonies and England. The consequences of the First Continental Congress: for the first time, colonies all meet together. Most colonies want a peaceful solution to the conflict rather than a separation from Britain. They send a respectful petition to King George III, asking him to consider their complaints and respect their rights. The colonies also agree to continue their boycott of British goods and form colonial militias. King George III ignores the petition and instead declares the colonies in a state of rebellion. Lexington and Concord, 1775. British troops march to seize colonial weapons and ammunition. They are met by American troops who've been alerted by Paul Revere and others, who open fire. The consequences of the battles at Lexington and Concord were enormous. The Americans beat the British troops at Concord, and then they chased the British all the way back to Boston. It is called the shot heard round the world because it launches democracy. It shows that colonists are not just willing to fight for rights, they're willing to die for them, and it starts the American Revolution. Both England and America had strengths and weaknesses during the American Revolution. For the English, their strength was in their army. It was the best army in the world, well-trained, well-supplied. However, they were fighting a war far from home, and this caused problems. For the Americas, they were fighting for patriotism. They also had George Washington. They believed in their cause. American weaknesses, they were always short of troops. They were untrained. They didn't have supplies, and they didn't have a monetary system to get supplies. The important document that came out of the American Revolution was the Declaration of Independence. It provided a formal explanation why the colonies were separating from Great Britain. It was broken into three parts. 1. It stated the doctrine of natural rights, which give the colonies the right to form an independent government. 2. It gives a list of grievances, which are complaints against the king, giving specific examples of how he violated the colonists' natural rights. And the third part is a conclusion. Because of how Britain has acted, the colonies now have the right to become free and independent states. Who were the founders? The men who wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence. Following the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 13 colonies become the first 13 states. These states are Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Key battles of the American Revolution include Fort Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, Trenton. That was December 1776. Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve to surprise Hessian mercenaries. The victory electrifies the Patriots. The Battle of Princeton, the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. This battle was important because it's the turning point of the war. The American victory causes France to enter the war on the side of America. Then Valley Forge, the winter of 1777-1778. Horrible conditions cause American troops to become disciplined, well-trained, and filled with a sense of purpose. Then the Battle of Monmouth, June 1778. An American victory causes Britain to take the war to the south, where there are more loyalists. The American Revolution was very violent in the South, which you could see from watching The Patriot. Americans, led by Francis Marion, whose nickname was the Swamp Fox, and Nathaniel Greene, used guerrilla tactics. The Battle of Yorktown was the last battle of the Revolution. Washington and the French fleet surrounded British General Cornwallis, and the Revolutionary War ends. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. Who was Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, which convinced many Americans to support the revolution? American government, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. What was America's first government? The Articles of Confederation. Why didn't the Articles of Confederation work? Well, they created a weak central government that was unable to solve the country's problems. The states had most of the power under the Articles, and they didn't always work together well. There was no executive branch. The United States was unable to pay its debts. Trade suffered. This was interstate and foreign. And to change or improve the Articles, all 13 states had to agree to changes, and that was almost impossible. Why didn't the founders create a strong central government? Well, colonial experiences under British rule made them afraid that such a government would be tyranny. There was also fear that some states might have too much power and dominate the other states. What were some of the achievements under the Articles? The country successfully waged a war of independence against Great Britain. It also negotiated a peace treaty to end the war, which was called the Peace Treaty of Paris, and passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 provided a formula for successfully dividing up the western lands. These lands I'm talking about were the future states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana. The Northwest Ordinance also provided a process for admitting new states into the Union. What caused Congress to abandon the Articles of Confederation and write a new Constitution? Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. The economic chaos caused by the Articles of Confederation provoked a revolt of farmers in western Massachusetts, led by a former Revolutionary soldier, Daniel Shays. Shays and his group tried to capture the arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. It convinced government leaders that something had to be done. In 1787, Congress calls for a convention of all the states to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, Congress decides to start from scratch and draft a new government. Who were the framers? The men who wrote the Constitution. Sources of the Constitution. The Magna Carta, written in 1215, this agreement limited the power of the monarch and listed certain rights given to the English people, for example, trial by jury. The English Bill of Rights, produced as a consequence of the Glorious Revolution, this 1689 document further limited the power of the monarch and gave Parliament a greater role in England's government. John Locke, his theory of natural rights and the social contract greatly influenced the founders and the framers. What are natural rights? Rights given to people at birth, such as life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the social contract or compact? Since government gets its power from the people, the government must look out for the interests of its citizens. If the government violates the social contract, the people have a right to abolish that government and set up a new one. Montesquieu. His theory of checks and balances and separation of powers greatly influenced the framers. What is popular sovereignty? People give their consent to a government and agree to follow its rules. The Constitutional Convention began on May 25, 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 55 delegates from 12 states attended, all white men. What were the two issues that divided the delegates attending the Constitutional Convention? Representation. We're talking about population here, not size. So it's states with lots of people versus states with very few people. Also, the subject of slavery was very divisive. Would slavery be legal? How would slaves be counted in the general population? The New Jersey Plan favored small states. It gave equal power to all the states. There was only one legislature, and each state would have the same number of delegates in that legislature. So, for example, Virginia would have as many as Little Rhode Island. The Virginia Plan was a plan favored by large states. It gave more power in the government to the larger states. This plan also had a bicameral legislature, which means two houses, and representation in that legislature would be based upon population. The Great Compromise settled the problems of representation and slavery. Representation. Congress would have a bicameral legislature, which means two houses, which is what we have. We have a House of Representatives as well as a Senate. The House of Representatives would be based upon population. The more people in a state, the greater number of representatives it would have. The Senate, on the other hand, would have equal representation. Each state would have two senators. Slavery. For the purposes of population representation, slaves would count as 3/5 of a person. The slave trade would also be outlawed in 1808. The Constitution. The Constitution is broken into 7 articles. Article 1, the legislative branch. Article 2, the executive branch. Article 3, the judicial branch. Article 4, responsibilities of the states, admission of new states, relationship between states and the federal government. Article 5, how the Constitution could be amended. Article 6, The Constitution and federal laws are the supreme laws of the land. Article 7, how the Constitution is to be ratified. Article 1, the legislative branch. The House of Representatives would be based upon population, their 435 congressmen, and the Speaker of the House is the presiding officer. Congressmen are elected every 2 years. They must be at least 25 years old and a U.S. citizen for 7 years. They must be elected. They cannot be appointed, and the House votes to impeach. The Senate. There are 2 senators per state. Senators are elected every 6 years. That means every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. Senators must be 30 years old and a citizen of that state for 9 years before being elected. The President of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. The Senate acts as the jury in an impeachment trial. The enumerated powers are the 17 specific powers given to the Congress under the Constitution. These powers include laying and collecting taxes, borrowing money, regulating foreign commerce, coining money, punishing counterfeiters, establishing post offices, declaring war, raising and supporting armies, and building roads. Where do all money bills originate? In the House of Representatives. What is the Elastic Clause? It is the clause that allows Congress to make all laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out the enumerated powers. When the framers wrote the Constitution, they knew that in time the United States would change. The Elastic Clause gives Congress the ability to adapt and get new powers and address new situations that the framers could not anticipate. Article 2, the Executive Branch. The Executive Branch. Under the terms of the Article 2, executive power in the branch is to be vested in a president. This president would serve a 4-year term, and his election would be determined by the Electoral College. The president must be 35 years old and born in the United States. Powers of the executive branch include administrating the laws, acting as commander-in-chief, granting pardons, negotiating treaties, addressing Congress once a year, appointing judges and ambassadors, and the president can be impeached. Article 3, the Judicial Branch. The Judicial Branch has a Supreme Court. Judges serve for life. Judges are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The Judicial Branch reviews decisions made by other courts, and they act as a court when a state is a party in a lawsuit. Separation of powers. When the framers wrote the Constitution, they deliberately separated the powers of government into 3 branches and gave each branch the power to check the power of a different branch. This is called checks and balances. The legislative branch has the power to write the laws, confirm presidential appointments, this is the Senate, approves treaties, also the Senate, appropriate money, this is the House of Representatives, declare war, vote to impeach, or override a presidential veto if 2/3 of both houses vote to do so. The executive branch proposes laws, administers laws, commands the armed forces, appoints ambassadors and other officials, conducts foreign policy, makes treaties, grants pardons, and can veto legislation. The judicial branch interprets the Constitution, can declare actions or decisions done by the President and the Congress unconstitutional, which means these actions and decisions get thrown out. They also review lower court decisions. What is federalism? A system of government that divides powers between the states and the federal government. Under our Constitution, power is not just separated among 3 different branches, which are given a check and a balance on powers. We divide power also between the federal government and the state governments. Under federalism, we have 3 types of power: delegated, reserved, and Delegated powers are those powers given only to the national government, such as those listed under the enumerated powers. Things like coining money, regulating trade, and waging war. Reserve powers are powers given only to the states. This includes education, holding elections, and creating local governments. Concurrent powers are those powers that are shared by both federal and state governments. These powers include taxation, enforcing laws, and borrowing money. How does a bill become a law? A bill is first introduced in the House or Senate. The bill is then referred to a House or Senate committee. The committee sends the bill to be voted on by the House or Senate. If a bill passes, that bill is then referred to the other house. For example, if a House bill passes, it is then referred to the Senate. This bill then goes through another committee process, this time in the Senate, and is voted on by the Senate. The bill then goes to the President, and if the President signs the bill, it becomes a law. Presidential veto. If a bill has been passed by the Congress that the President does not like, he may veto it. Overriding a presidential veto. If Congress can get 2/3 of the members of each house to vote to override the President's veto, the bill becomes law anyway. Article 5, amending the Constitution. It's not an easy thing to amend the Constitution, and over the course of our history, only 33 amendments have been ratified. There are 4 methods to amend the Constitution. However, all amendments, with one exception, have followed the following procedure. 2/3 of both houses of Congress must propose and then successfully vote for the amendment. That voted on amendment is then sent to each of the states. The states hold something called a state ratifying convention, and if 3/4 of the states vote for the amendment is considered accepted and becomes law. Article 7, ratification. After the Constitution was written, it needed to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states for it to become law of the land. There was great debate and fighting over whether the Constitution would be ratified. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay pushed very hard for ratification. In most states, the voting was very, very close. 2 states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, refused to ratify the Constitution until it contained a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights. What is the Bill of Rights? The first 10 amendments of the Constitution. It was ratified on December 15, 1791. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment, the government can't quarter troops in private homes. The Fourth Amendment, the government can't search your house and seize your property without a warrant. The Fifth Amendment, everyone must receive due process under the law. Double jeopardy. You can't be forced to testify against yourself, and the government must pay you if it takes away your land or property. The Sixth Amendment, the right to a speedy trial by an impartial jury. The Seventh Amendment allows for trial by jury for civil suits. This means ordinary life, not criminal. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and cruel or unusual punishments. The Ninth Amendment says that the rights guaranteed in Amendments 1 through 8 are not the only rights given to the people. The 10th Amendment, powers not mentioned in the Constitution which are not specifically forbidden are reserved for the states. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It was ratified December 6, 1865. The 14th Amendment required states to respect the freedoms listed in the Bill of Rights. It defined citizenship, It provided due process under the law, and it provided equal protection under the law. It was ratified on July 9, 1868. The 15th Amendment gave African American males the right to vote. It was ratified February 3, 1870. Rights, duties, and responsibilities of citizens. A right is a freedom guaranteed to you by the government. This includes speech, press, religion, assembly, petition, bear arms, due process, and equality under the law. A duty is an action you are required to do. This includes obeying the laws, registering for the draft, defending the nation in times of war, serving on a jury when called, and paying your taxes. A responsibility is something you should do as a citizen. This includes voting, volunteering, participating in government, like running for an office, influencing government, and staying informed about current events. Forming a government. Once the Constitution was ratified, President George Washington established the new American government. His Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, quickly came into conflict with Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. Both men had very different visions about the role government should play in the new United States. For government, Hamilton wanted a strong central federal government, while Jefferson wanted to protect the powers of the states. In terms of the economy, Hamilton wanted to promote manufacturing and business. Jefferson wanted to promote agriculture. Tariffs. Hamilton wanted strong protective tariffs placed on imported goods to help the newly developing U.S. manufacturing and business. Jefferson believed tariffs would make imported goods too expensive for farmers to buy. For a national bank, Hamilton thought the government needed to have a bank as a safe place to deposit money and mint money. Jefferson felt the national bank gave too much power to the federal government. The Elastic Clause. Hamilton felt the Constitution gave government the right to make laws that were necessary and proper, where Jefferson felt the Elastic Clause should only be allowed to be used on very special occasions. This rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson developed into the formation of political parties. The Federalist Party was led by Hamilton. It favored ties with Great Britain and loose construction. In other words, use that Elastic Clause. The Democratic Republican Party was led by Jefferson. It favored ties with France and strict construction. In other words, don't use that Elastic Clause. To get Jefferson's support for Hamilton's economic plan, Hamilton cut a deal to move the nation's capital to the south, to where Washington, D.C. is today. The first nation's capital was in New York. It then moved to Philadelphia. Washington, D.C. was built on land taken from Virginia and Maryland. The Judiciary Act of 1789 was one of Washington's first accomplishments. It established the Supreme Court and several lower courts. Remember, the Constitution said very little about the judiciary except that a court system was to be established. What was the Whiskey Rebellion? An uprising by western Pennsylvania farmers over taxes. Washington personally led 13,000 troops to Pennsylvania to crush the rebellion. It was the only time a sitting president has led an army. The presidency of John Adams, our second president. During this time, England and France were at war and kept trying to bring the United States into the conflict. The United States, however, wanted to stay neutral. The Alien and Sedition Acts were very unpopular. They took away First Amendment rights. They were passed in an attempt to protect the U.S. against a possible war with France, and these two acts probably kept John Adams from being elected to a second term. The XYZ affair showed American outrage over the French foreign minister's demand for a bribe in order to meet with the American ambassadors. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. These were arguments made by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. These resolutions were later held as a precedent that states had the right to challenge the power of the federal government. A new nation, the presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. When Jefferson was elected in 1800, it meant a new political party took office. The peaceful transfer of power between the Federalists who were in office and the Democratic Republicans who were entering office set a precedent. Marbury versus Madison. This is the court case that established the principle of judicial review. In doing so, it made the judicial branch of government the equal of the legislative and executive branches. The Jefferson administration. As president, Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase from France. In doing so, he reversed himself and acted like a loose constructionist. There is nothing in the Constitution that mentions buying large parcels of land from other countries. Jefferson originally only wanted to buy the port of New Orleans, but France offered to sell him the entire Louisiana area for 3 cents an acre. This purchase doubled the size of the country. Jefferson then sent an expedition out to map the northern part of the territory, which we know as the Lewis and Clark expedition, while Zebulon Pike led the expedition to map out the southern edge. The War of 1812. For many years, the United States continued to have trouble with both England and France over their impressment of American sailors. Both England and France were stopping our ships on the high seas, taking our sailors off our ships, and forcing those sailors to work on their ships. Great Britain was also encouraging Indians to attack Western settlers. Pushed by the war hawks, a faction in Congress, Congress ends up declaring war. In a really stupid move, an American force marches into Canada and burns its capital, called York. It's now Toronto. The British retaliate by burning our capital, Washington, D.C., including the White House and the Congress. During the Battle of Baltimore at Fort McHenry, the Star-Spangled Banner is written, giving us our national anthem. And Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans and instantly became an American hero. Ironically, this battle was fought days after a peace treaty had been signed between England and the United States ending the war, but because of the primitive communications that existed back then, Jackson didn't know. Indian problems. The Treaty of Greenville, signed following the Indian defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, requires Native Americans to leave the Northwest Territories. We're talking Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. The presidency of James Monroe, which is often called the era of good feeling. The War of 1812 created a national unity. The United States is proud it stood up to Great Britain. The Monroe Doctrine. This document warns European nations that the Western Hemisphere is not open to colonization. It says the United States will look at European moves into the Western Hemisphere as threats to the United States' power and safety. It also says that New World governments are to be republics, not monarchies. And last, promises that if Europe stays out of our affairs, we will stay out of theirs. Americans were very proud of the Monroe Doctrines, but over in Europe, they sneered at us. The Jackson Era. The elections of 1824 and 1828 reflected a huge increase in the electorate. The new western states didn't have property requirements, so more people could vote. There was also a growing middle class in the North, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Consequences of the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but not the electoral vote. So the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. Henry Clay convinces the members to give the election to John Quincy Adams. And President Adams then names Henry Clay Secretary of State, which was considered a stepping stone to the presidency. Jackson supporters screamed that a corrupt bargain had occurred, and Jackson formed the Democratic Party. The Jackson presidency. Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828 and was a very controversial president. He believed that every person was fit to rule. One of the things he did was establish the spoils system, which we still have today. He threw government workers out of their jobs and put his supporters in their place. Administrations now routinely change staff when they take office. He was called King Andrew I by his enemies. Jackson's fight with the bank. Andrew Jackson did not like the National Bank. He called it a money monster and said it favored the rich over the poor. In this political cartoon, Jackson is shown fighting the 9 bank directors who are pictured as a 9-headed hydra. Unfortunately, Jackson's actions ended up leading to the Depression of 1837. The Indian Removal Act. Andrew Jackson did not like Native Americans. As president, he defied a Supreme Court ruling and forced all Native Americans to move west of the Mississippi. So many Cherokee died along the way, the path is now called the Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson, in doing so, directly violated the U.S. Constitution. But because Western farmers were glad to see the Native Americans go, nothing was done about it. The nullification crisis. In order to understand the nullification crisis, you have to understand the differences that were really beginning to divide the North from the South. In the North, an industrial revolution was going on. Factories and businesses were going up, and these factories and businesses were producing finished goods which often had to compete against cheaper European finished goods. To help the northern industry, Congress passed a tax called a tariff on these imported European goods, making them more expensive. The South screamed because the South now had to pay more money for its finished goods. Remember, the South didn't have any industries of its own. The president supported the tariff. The South, led by Vice President John C. Calhoun, called the tariff of abominations and stated that states had the right to nullify or get rid of a federal law if they didn't like them. Jackson declared he was going to hang as vice president, and Calhoun took Jackson so seriously he went into hiding. Controversy over this tariff eventually led to the Civil War, but it set the precedent of states' rights that states didn't have to go along with a federal government law if it didn't like it. Andrew Jackson's opponents like to call him King Andrew I, which is shown in this political cartoon. Why do you think Jackson was called that? Well, Jackson did a lot of things that made a lot of people very angry, and he wasn't afraid to use power. Some of the things we've discussed was that he ignored a Supreme Court ruling, which really should have had him impeached, and forced all the Cherokee to move to the western lands. He also threw government workers out of their jobs and put his own friends in, which was called the spoils system. He then pushed for the nullification crisis, or the tariff of abominations, which made the South all angry at him. In short, Andrew Jackson didn't always go about things the correct way, and a lot of people just felt he grabbed too much power and he used it as though he was part of a monarchy rather than a three-branch system of government. The Great Triumvirate. The Great Triumvirate is a name given to 3 senators who worked together to promote American industry, yet represented different regions of the country and different business interests. Daniel Webster represented northern industry and banks. He was from Massachusetts. Henry Clay represented the interests of the emerging West and the farmers there. He was from Kentucky. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina represented the interests of Southern slaveholders. Expanding nation. Manifest destiny is a term meaning obvious fate, and it was a philosophy that the U.S. had the God-given right to bring American democracy and way of life from sea to shining sea. How did our country end up stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean? Well, in the beginning, we had the original colonies all stretched along the eastern seaboard. That was in 1776. When we won the American Revolution, Great Britain gave us the western lands which stretched the Mississippi River. That was in 1783. The Louisiana Purchase was added in 1803. Florida was purchased from Spain in 1819, and Texas entered the Union as an independent republic in 1845. Oregon Territory was negotiated from the British in 1846, and the Mexican Cession in 1848 was added to the country as a consequence of the Mexican-American War. Then we purchased the Gadsden Purchase in 1854. The cotton gin played a huge role in the push to settle the western lands. It allowed cotton seeds to be removed quickly and cheaply from cotton balls. It created a demand for cotton, fueled by the Industrial Revolution in the North and in England. It reestablished a need for slave labor, and it fueled western expansion to find new areas to grow cotton. Texas. Americans were invited to settle Texas by the Mexican government because at that time Texas was almost empty of people. However, conflicts over slavery, civil liberties, religion, and a language caused Texans to revolt. They won their independence in 1836, but were unable to become a U.S. state until 1845 because Texas's entry into the Union would upset the balance between slave and free states in the United States Senate. Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was fought over the border between the United States and Mexico. It was a war that the United States won easily. The Mexican Cession was added to the country as a consequence of the war. It added about 25% more land to the nation. And the Mexican-American War was also important because it was considered a training ground for future military leaders in the American Civil War like Robert E. Lee and General Ulysses S. Grant. California Gold Rush. Gold was discovered in 1849 in California, and gold fever swept the globe. There was sudden, huge immigration from abroad and at home. People arrived over land, which was very difficult, and also by sea, which was also difficult. However, one of the ironies of the gold rush was that businesses who supplied the miners made a great deal more money than the miners themselves. The Industrial Revolution. This was a period of rapid growth in using machines for manufacturing and production of goods. It was centered in New England. It allowed for the mass production of goods. The first goods produced were textiles and thread. Eli Whitney, inventor of the cotton gin, also helped with his idea of interchangeable parts. Water was used as the main power source of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution caused women and children to begin to enter the job market, and it also caused people to begin moving from farms to cities to work in the factories. The Transportation Revolution. While the Industrial Revolution was changing the way we made things here in the United States, a transportation revolution was also changing how we travel. This included railroads, canals, the national road that linked the western lands to the east, and the steamboat, which allowed ships to travel upriver quickly. Some of the inventions of the Industrial Revolution included the telegraph, which allowed for instant communication, the stove, which made cooking a lot easier than using a fireplace, the sewing machine, which could be used at home and helped create the garment industry, which allowed for mass production of clothes, the reaper that allowed for mass harvesting of grain, and then John Deere's iron plow, which opened up the western prairie to agriculture. The Women's Rights Movement. The Women's Rights Movement was closely tied to the abolitionist movement because both movements concerned rights for sections of the population that didn't seem to have any slaves and women. The Seneca Falls Convention was held in 1848, It issued a Declaration of Sentiments that was based upon the Declaration of Independence. However, women didn't end up getting their right to vote until the 20th century. The road to war. In the early 19th century, sharp divisions began appearing in the United States. Slavery. Some wanted it to be abolished, some wanted to limit its growth in the territories added during Manifest Destiny. Sectionalism. The U.S. had split into three distinct areas, the South, the North, and the West. Each region had specific needs and a way of life. Each region wanted its representatives in Congress to put those needs ahead of other regions. Then there was also the conflict between strong central government versus states' rights. The North. The North had more people. This was mostly because of immigration. It was the center of industrial revolution. There were jobs for the immigrants to go to. It had large cities. It wanted tariffs to protect industry. It was the center of the abolitionist movement, and Daniel Webster was its spokesman. The South was rural, not heavily populated. Plantation agriculture was used to produce cash crops. Slavery provided cheap labor. There was little infrastructure. People used rivers. There were not many roads, railroads, or canals. The South was strongly against tariffs, and John C. Calhoun was its spokesman. The West. The West had its own unique set of needs. It wanted roads and infrastructure. It wanted a way to get its goods to market. There was a question, would the West be slave or free? Its economy was just emerging. It also wanted policies that encouraged agriculture and settlement, helped with the Indian problem, and Henry Clay was its spokesman. Most conflict between the North and the South and the West was centered in the U.S. Senate. The North had more representation in the House of Representatives. If a balance between slave and free states existed in the Senate, then no anti-slavery legislation could be passed. The Missouri Compromise, 1820. Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, not as a free state, which I've typed here. It's supposed to be slave state. Its entry would give slave states a majority in the Senate. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, worked out a compromise, which became known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. At the same time, Maine would enter the Union as a free state. No slavery was going to be allowed in the new territories above Missouri's southern border, and the Missouri Compromise, however imperfect, kept the peace for another 30 years. The Compromise of 1850. The huge land brought into the country by the Mexican Cession, as well as a growing demand for cotton, sparked a debate to allow slavery above Missouri's southern border. Slavery had not been allowed because of the Missouri Compromise. It was decided that popular sovereignty was going to be used to decide the slavery issue in the territories. In other words, let the people living there decide whether they were to be slave or free. In the meantime, California was going to enter the Union as a free state, and a strong fugitive slave law was passed, which pleased the South, but really angered Northern abolitionists. If you were against slavery, then the Fugitive Slave Act was really something that was going to make you angry. This act made it a crime to assist runaway slaves. Further, it levied stiff penalties and fines for helping runaways. Escaped slaves could now be arrested in free territories and returned to their owners. Slaves were not going to be allowed to testify in their own behalf, and the legislation rewarded white owners and witnesses at the expense of slaves or black freemen. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It was proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas, and it organized the Louisiana Territory into two regions, Kansas and Nebraska. Popular sovereignty was going to be used to decide the issue of slavery in the territories. What happened? Pro- and anti-slavery forces rushed to move to Kansas, and the fighting got so intense, Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it ended up dividing the Democratic Party. Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rush into Kansas as a consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The result is violence and dirty politics, as each group is determined to drive the other one out. John Brown, an abolitionist, leads a group of men to Pottawatomie Creek one night, drags 5 pro-slavery settlers out of their beds, and hacks them to death. Meanwhile, pro-slavery forces destroy the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas. The result was civil war and bloodshed in Kansas. The problems in Kansas spilled into the United States Senate. One day, Senator Charles Sumner gave a speech in which he criticized the pro-slavery forces in Kansas and happened to also criticize a fellow senator, Senator Butler, as well. The next day, Butler's relative, Representative Preston Brooks, who took offense at what Senator Sumner said, stormed into the Senate and beat Senator Sumner senseless with his cane. Sumner was beaten so badly it took him 3 years to return to work. As for Representative Brooks, well, he was fined, but he was never punished for what he did. Harper's Ferry. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry. He hoped to seize the weapons of the federal arsenal and start an armed revolt to abolish slavery. Brown expected slaves and other abolitionists to join him. None did. Brown suffered heavy losses, was captured and hung. Southerners began to worry about another John Brown, too, and began to say that individuals in pro-slavery states could only find safety outside the Union. The Republican Party. This political organization was formed in 1854 to take a united stand against the spread of slavery in the western United States. Slavery. In 1619, the first slaves arrived in Jamestown. Slavery becomes the preferred labor force for southern plantations. The process by which slaves were brought to the U.S. was indescribably horrible. The U.S. Constitution declared slavery legal, and slaves were to count as 3/5 of a person. However, the slave trade was to be outlawed in 1808. Eli Whitney's cotton gin greatly increased the demand for slave labor. The Triangle Trade. The Triangle Trade was not just about bringing enslaved Africans to the New World. It was also part of mercantilism, where there were a series of 3 specific trade routes running between Europe, Africa, and North America. The first leg, from England to Africa, brought finished goods, things like mirrors, kettles, cloth, and guns, to Africa. These finished goods would be exchanged for slaves, which went on the Middle Passage from Africa to North America or the Caribbean or South America. The Middle Passage is known for its total brutality. The third leg went from North America to England, bringing raw materials, things like wood, fish, cotton, rice, and indigo for England's emerging factories. The Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave who lived for a time in a free territory. Upon returning to his home state of Missouri, he filed suit, saying the time he spent in a free state made him free. He won in a lower court. The Supreme Court overturned the lower court's decision and enraged abolitionists throughout the country. The Supreme Court decision. No African Americans, slave or free, could be citizens under the Constitution. Because Scott was not a citizen, he could not sue in court. Scott was to remain a slave. Further, the Constitution, since it provided for slavery in all federal territories, Congress was not allowed to place restriction on slavery in the new territories. This overturned the Missouri Compromise. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Lincoln in 1863. It freed slaves in the Confederate States. The Civil War was still going on. It did not free slaves in the border states. It energized soldiers fighting for the Union. Important amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave due process under the law and equal protection under the law to new black citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave African American males the right to vote. The abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Tubman, John Brown, and Sojourner Truth. Who were they? William Lloyd Garrison published the leading abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who wrote a narrative describing his life in slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a best-selling book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and motivated many to support the abolitionist movement. Sojourner Truth also wrote a narrative which made the case for both abolition and women's rights. Harriet Tubman was a leading conductor on the Underground Railroad. John Brown wanted to abolish slavery through armed insurrection. He wanted a violent, sudden end to slavery. He was responsible for the Potawatomi Massacre and Harper's Ferry. The Underground Railroad, an informal network of secret routes and safe houses used by escaped slaves to free states and Canada. The Civil War. The election of 1860. Lincoln, a Republican, runs against 3 Democrats. Lincoln is running on an anti-slavery platform. Lincoln doesn't pick up a single electoral vote in the South, and 7 southern states secede from the Union before he is inaugurated. Fort Sumter. The Civil War began when Confederate guns began firing on the Union fort in Charleston, South Carolina. The date was April 12, 1861. The leaders. For the Union, Abraham Lincoln was president. Ulysses S. Grant was the chief general. He led the Army of the Potomac. William Sherman was his main assistant. He led a very famous march to the sea from Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean and brought total war to the civilian population of the South. For the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis was the president. Robert E. Lee commanded the Army of Northern Virginia. He was the main general. And Stonewall Jackson was Lee's right arm. The border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were slave states that did not leave the Union and join the Confederacy. Look at this chart and you can see that the North, at the beginning of the war, simply had more resources. It had more factories, it had more people, it had more money, it had more railroad lines, it had more of just about everything. The North's strategy for winning the war was the Anaconda Plan. In this plan, the North was to encircle the South like a giant snake, blocking off all its ports and taking control of the Mississippi River. The Civil War was fought on 2 fronts, in the East and in the West. In the East, battles were fought in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The object was to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. In the West, the object was to take control of the Mississippi River. This action would not just cut off Southern exports and imports, it would also prevent the eastern part of the Confederacy from being able to get in contact with the western part of the Confederacy, states like Arkansas and Texas. Major battles of the Civil War included Fort Sumter, which began the war, Bull Run, which was the first major battle, Antietam, which became the bloodiest day in American history, Gettysburg, which was the turning point of the war, and Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered to General Grant. Copperheads, Northern Democrats who didn't support the Civil War. The Lincoln assassination. President Lincoln was assassinated just days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. It was a conspiracy led by John Wilkes Booth. The conspirators were captured and hung, and the consequence was that Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, became President of the United States. Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the period following the Civil War where 1. The Union had to find a way to allow Confederate states to rejoin the Union. 2. The Union had to figure out how to integrate the newly freed slaves into Southern society. President Johnson and the radical Republicans had problems. Johnson and the Republicans in Congress had conflicting ideas how to handle the defeated South. The radical Republicans wanted to punish the South. Johnson, as did Lincoln before him, wanted a kinder, gentler approach. The Republicans impeached Johnson, who escapes conviction by one vote. During Reconstruction, the South is carved into 5 military districts, each guarded by federal troops. A procedure is also adopted to readmit Confederate, states into the Union. Who were carpetbaggers? They were Yankees who moved south after the Civil War, hoping to take financial advantage of the defeated South. They brought with them all their possessions stuffed in a carpetbag suitcase. Scalawags. Scalawags were Southern whites who supported Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency that was set up to assist newly freed slaves after the war. You can imagine how difficult it must have been for the slaves. They needed education, housing, food, clothing, jobs. The Freedmen's Bureau was put in place to help them. 1877, federal troops leave the South. Reconstruction ends, so has this class. Thank you very much for your time and attention.